Imagine a packed dance floor, the bass reverberating through the air, strobe lights painting the crowd in flashes of electric color, drinks flowing, the city's most stylish mingling, and the energy at its peak amid this vibrant chaos. Kirk, Frost, and young Jock appeared to be dressed to impress, but their minds were on more than just celebrating. Unbeknownst to the partygoers, their target was none other than Lil Scrappy, a man known for lighting up any room with his contagious charisma. The tension increased gradually. There were a few acerbic glances, quiet conversations, and a storm simmering just below the surface. And then it happened. The atmosphere changed from joyous to stunned in an instant. Words became heated, and soon the dance floor center was transformed into a spectacle that everyone could not take their eyes off of. Some frantically grabbed their phones to record the drama as it unfolded, while others froze, too shocked to respond. It wasn't just an argument, though. It was a full-fledged brawl that left the entire club buzzing. If you were someone worth knowing, this was the place to be. The main dance floor was a mass of moving bodies swaying to the DJ's music, and the line to get in had snaked around the block, drawing in some of the city's most stylish and well-connected faces. The night was young, but the energy inside the Atlanta nightclub was already reaching its peak. It was the kind of night that people talk about for weeks, with loud music, flashing lights, and a crowd that seemed to get more lively by the minute. On the outskirts of the floor, small groups of people were gathered near the bar, balancing their cocktails and shouting over the noise. Everyone seemed to be having a time, but up in the VIP section, a different kind of energy was brewing that wasn't about celebration. Kirk, Frost, and young Jock were seated in their reserved booth, their entourages buzzing around them. The two men looked sharp in designer jackets and their outfits, and they were sporting the kind of. There was an edge to their interactions that hadn't been present on any of their previous high-profile nights out. Those around them either didn't notice or were too busy enjoying the benefits that came with being associated with two of the celebrities. At first glance, they seemed at ease, laughing and chatting while sipping pricey liquor, but anyone paying closer attention would have noticed something slightly off. Kirk's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Jock's laugh came a fraction of a second too late. Across the room in another VIP booth, Lil Scrappy was the focal point of his own scene, where Kirk and the Jock appeared reflective. Scrappy exuded pure charisma as he rose from the crowd with ease, his laugh booming over the music, his arms moving in time with the beat, and his infectious smile. He was surrounded by a close-knit group of friends who were obviously enjoying themselves, and many people stopped by to pay their respects. Scrappy had long been known for his magnetic personality, the kind that turned casual. Tonight seemed to be no different. But behind the scenes, things weren't as easygoing as they seemed. Kirk and Jock looked at Scrappy's booth. At first, it was just a glance here, a whispered comment there, but as the minutes went by, the subtle clues started to pile up. Kirk leaned closer to Jock, his mouth moving quickly as the music roared on, and Jock's expression darkened for a moment before he nodded and kept his eyes fixed on Scrappy. Whatever they were talking about, it was obvious that this wasn't small talk, and the tension started to radiate outward. While the energy at Scrappy's table continued unabated, he was in his element, taking a break from his seated group to make his way toward the dance floor, clinking glasses with a few familiar faces along the way. If he was aware of the scrutiny from the other side of the club, he didn't show it. The waitress delivering a tray of drinks to their booth hesitated when she felt the shift, her eyes flickering from Kirk's set jaw to Jock's narrowed eyes. He spoke in a voice that was just loud enough to be heard over the pounding bass, and Kirk didn't answer right away. His attention was fixed on Scrappy's every move, and when he finally nodded, he said, "Yeah," in a measured tone. The three men had been in the same circles for years, going to the same events and running into each other on the same stages. Although their public interactions had frequently appeared to be cordial enough, those close to them knew that there were underlying tensions. The DJ switched to a new song. The dance floor erupted, the lights flashed faster, the crowd surged closer together, and the night's energy hit another high. Scrappy's reputation for saying whatever was on his mind made him both a beloved and polarizing figure for Kirk and Jockey. It wasn't just about the man himself. It was about what he represented. Scrappy's carefree attitude and growing popularity were seen by some as a threat, especially if it came at the expense of others in the same orbit. A small portion of the crowd turned to watch as the two men closed the distance. Their confident, measured steps stood in stark contrast to the chaotic movements of the dancers around them. Deliberately, without a word to their group, they started cutting a path straight towards Scrappy. Meanwhile, he was completely engrossed in the music on the edge of the dance floor, gesturing to a few fans who called out his name and raising his glass in acknowledgement. He didn't notice Kirk and the jock approaching, but those around him did. It was too late to avoid them. Kirk stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, and Jockey took a step closer. The air around them seemed to change, and the music faded into the background as a sudden heavy silence fell on their immediate area. Scrappy lowered his drink a little, his smile dimming, and his posture straightened as he assessed the situation. "What's going on, fellas?" Scrappy asked in a casual but cautious tone, and his crew, still seated in the booth, shifted uneasily, a couple of them standing there, their eyes fixed on Kirk and Jockey. Was evident, and a small group of people leaned in, sensing that something was going to happen. Kirk didn't respond right away, instead glancing at Scrappy, whose expression was unreadable, before he finally said, "You've been running your mouth." His voice was low, even stirring up drama, and Scrappy raised an eyebrow, tightening his grip on the glass in his hand. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. He turned back to his booth, where his crew was now on full alert, and a few whispered among themselves, but no one was listening. Made a move. The confrontation was Scrappy's, and he knew it. He turned back to face Kirk and Jock, and his posture study showed that if you have something to say, say it. Jock moved forward, closing the distance between them, and although his body language was calm, there was no mistaking the tension in his eyes. "We've got plenty to say," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "And if you're smart, you'll listen." Scrappy didn't back down. "Oh yeah, like what?" he asked, his tone edging into defiance. His free hand balled into a fist at his side, and for the first time, he appeared prepared to defend. The nightclub CO was no longer just a place for dancing and drinking. The area where Kirk Frost, Young Jock, and Lil Scrappy stood had become a hot of tension. The music continued to thump, the lights continued to flash, and people continued to laugh and dance nearby. But in this corner of the room, the atmosphere was entirely different, as everyone was close enough to see it. He took a small step forward and was now standing almost toe-to-toe with the jock. What was going on made them hold their breath, and their eyes darted between the three men. Scrappy's crew was on high alert, and some of them were standing while others were standing close to the booth, talking in hushed but urgent tones. A few of them exchanged nervous looks as they attempted to read the situation. Scrappy was still in a verbal standoff with Kirk and Jock. He was used to conflict, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a heated exchange on television with cameras rolling, and the stakes were personal. He pointed the finger at Scrappy, saying, "You've been talking out of line and spreading lies. You think you can just run your mouth and not face the consequences." Scrappy lifted his chin and narrowed his eyes, saying, "If I have something to say, I'll say it." Kirk stepped forward, his face colder than ever, saying, "But don't come at me with these weak accusations unless you have something solid. We have more than just words, Scrappy, and we have receipts. You want to deny what you've been saying behind our back box, which is fine, but we both know the truth." Before holding the phone up, he quickly swiped to unlock it. The glare of the device reflected off Scrappy's face as he squinted at whatever was displayed, unable to make out the details, but the weight of Kirk's gesture said enough. Scrappy's jaw tightened. "So what? Now you're going to show me some out-of-context messages. That's your proof, man. Miss me with that nonsense," he said, waving a dismissive hand, but his voice was less certain than before, a slight crack in his confidence starting to show that his bravado remained intact, but his posture told a different story. As if preparing for the next move, Jock moved closer to Kirk, almost shoulder to shoulder. "Now isn't out of context, but," he said, You've been playing both sides, saying one thing to us and another to everybody else. It's time to own up before it gets worse." Scrappy's frustration boiled over, and he squared his shoulders and planted his feet, facing the two men directly. "You think you can come in here and press me? Who do you think you are?" he said, and then abruptly Kirk moved forward, invading Scrappy's personal space. The jock clenched his fists, Kirk's eyes narrowed, and Scrappy's crew edged closer, ready to jump in at a moment's notice. The music and lights nearly drowned out the voice, but it was still loud enough to send a chill down Scrappy's spine. "Keep talking, and you'll see what happens next." Scrappy couldn't flinch. Instead, he stood his ground, his gaze locked with Kirk's. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice steady even as his heartbeat raced. Irrelevant now, everyone was watching, waiting for what seemed inevitable. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, one of the club's security guards stepped between them. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice firm. He put a hand on Kirk's shoulder and pushed him back a step, gently but firmly. Kirk didn't resist, but he kept his eyes on Scrappy, who was still looking hard. The jock relaxed a little, taking a step back, but his posture relaxed as the immediate threat. The security guard motioned for Kirk and Jock to return to their booth. "I don't care who you are," he said in an unyielding tone, "because this isn't the place for that." For a moment, it seemed like Kirk and Jock might refuse, but they stood their ground, their expressions unreadable, and then Kirk nodded and put his phone back in his pocket. "We'll settle another time," he said, making his voice low enough that only those closest could hear him. Scrappy didn't move the last time before turning and walking away with Kirk back toward their VIP section. His breath was still a little heavier than usual, and his crew started chatting around him. One of his friends leaned in and asked, "You good, man?" In a wordy tone. "I'm good," Scrappy said, though there was a hint of tension in his voice. He picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and turned toward his booth. They were all talking, as always, but as he sat down, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that this wasn't over the looks Kirk and Jock had given him. As the night wore on, the tension remained, and Kirk and Jock had returned to their booth, but they were no longer drinking or talking as before. Instead, they sat quietly, their faces set in stone, and their eyes occasionally drifted towards Scrappy's side of the club. The energy between them had changed, and they were no longer just two men seeking fun. Instead, they were men waiting, watching, and deciding what to do next. Scrappy, on the other hand, had tried his best to shake off the altercation back in his. People closest to Scrappy could see that the encounter had left him uneasy. He wasn't afraid exactly, but he knew this wasn't over, and he was right. Word of the altercation spread quickly throughout the club, taking what had started as a private standoff and turning it into public knowledge. Scrappy was surrounded by his crew, who were obviously still on edge. They spoke in hushed tones and had tense body language, as though any sudden move might set things off again. It didn't matter that the altercation hadn't escalated into a physical altercation. Rumors turned it into something much bigger by the time clubgoers began pulling out their phones. The story was already taking on a life of its own, and a shaky video taken from across the room started making the rounds on social media. One woman claimed that Kirk and Jock had been prepared to swing, while a man at the bar told his friends that Scrappy had stood them down like a champ. In the VIP section, Kirk checked his phone and saw the hashtags and videos and the comments pouring in. Some people were supporting him and Jock, claiming that Scrappy had finally gotten what he deserved, while others were firmly in Scrappy's corner, praising his ability to stand his ground. The tension was evident, but it was soon enough that hashtags began trending. Hashtag Kirk versus Scrappy, hashtag Jay got receipts, and hashtag Club Karma A Tito. The club staff, doing their best to keep the peace, soon realized that the events of the night had left their establishment at the center of a developing viral moment. He leaned toward the jock and showed him the screen, saying, "We're the bad guys." Kirk muttered, "It's just noise." But the jock shook his head. "Maybe it's time we set the record straight." Kirk nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "We need to handle this." Meanwhile, Scrappy's crew was watching the same social media storm unfold on their phones. One of his friends turned the screen toward him and said, "You're a legend, man." Scrappy tried to lighten the mood by saying, "They're calling you the king of the club." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sure," he said, "but we both know they're not done with this." He pointed to Kirk and Jock's booth, where they were sitting and plotting. "You think this is the end? Nina, they're just getting started." As the club started to wind down, the crowd thinned out though, and people were still exchanging stories about what had happened. Some people lingered in the parking lot, wondering what would happen next. Everyone who was present that night felt as though they were a part of something greater than a night out. It was more than a story now. It was a narrative that everyone wanted to follow inside. Kirk and Jock finally got up. They hadn't had another drink or spoken much to one another since the confrontation because the tension between them and Scrappy was so great that they didn't need to. They looked at one another, and Kirk nodded toward the exit, saying, "Let's go." Jock followed without question, and the two men left the club as quiet as their approach had been earlier in the evening. But their silence didn't mean they were finished. Rather, it meant they were preparing their next move. Scrappy watched them go from the other side of the room, his jaw clenched under his breath. He thought they were simply going to leave and come at me another day, but his best friend leaned in and whispered something to him. But Scrappy shook his head, saying, "No, this isn't over outside the club." The air was cooler, but the atmosphere was still charged. While others were talking excitedly about what had happened that night, Kirk and Jock passed them without saying anything. But some people turned to watch. Even though their presence carried weight, people moved aside to give them space, as if the tension from the club was still following them. They got into their car, closed the doors, and drove away. The glow from their phones lit up the interior as they scrolled through the online reactions, and for every person who was complimenting Scrappy's poise, someone else was calling. Kirk's face hardened as he read the comments, which were a battleground. "You know what we need to do," Kirk said after a long pause. Jock looked at him with a knowing look in his eyes. He nodded slowly. They didn't need to explain that the altercation in the club may have ended, but the real fight was just getting started. That's where we stand, my friends. Tensions are heating up, alliances are disintegrating, and questions are still unanswered. Now it's your turn. What do you think actually happened in that nightclub? Do you think Kirk and Jock have something to say? Prove it, or is Scrappy just the latest victim of some backstage drama? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Furthermore, remember to hit the bell icon, like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you'll be the first to know what happens next. I promise you that the story isn't finished and that the fallout from this explosive night is just getting worse. Began.